Welcome to Business Recipe. Every business has a recipe. Here's theirs. Today's recipe: your hospital's landlord. It has never treated a patient, and it still collected $3 billion for its shareholders. Weeks before Sungida Rashid gave birth at a Boston hospital, that landlord's tenant let the device her doctors needed get repossessed. This isn't a story about a doctor. It's a story about who owns the building. Yes, he's one historian and who never had to answer for any of it. Here's what this recipe contains. You already know one version of this story: a private equity villain, a $40 million yacht, a CEO who became the first person held in criminal contempt of Congress since 1971. That story is true. It is also not the reason these hospitals actually ran out of money. First, the ingredients. How a company that owns real estate, not hospitals, ended up controlling 9 Massachusetts hospitals for 9 times what they were worth. Second, the method. Rent set so high it equaled 3/4 of that price every single year, while the landlord collected over $3 billion for its own shareholders. Third, the result: a $2.5 million unpaid bill, a repossessed device, and a settlement so quiet almost nobody covered it. By the end, you'll have 3 signs that tell you when a building's owner was never in the business of healing anyone. In 2010, private equity firm Cerberus Capital Management bought 6 Catholic hospitals in Massachusetts and built them into Steward Health Care. Kearney Hospital in Dorchester was one of them. Steward's purchase price, roughly $12.5 million. 6 years later, in September 2016, a real estate investment trust called Medical Properties Trust bought the buildings underneath Kearney Hospital. Not the hospital, just the real estate, for $263 million. The Boston Globe's own calculation: an increase of just over 2,000%. Kearney wasn't the outlier. Across all 9 Massachusetts hospitals in the same deal. Among them, Good Samaritan Medical Center in Brockton and the Holy Family campuses in Methuen and Haverhill. Prices rose by anywhere from 650 to over 2,000%. Total transaction value: $1.25 billion. Medical Properties Trust doesn't run hospitals. It's a real estate investment trust. By law, it hands at least 90% of its taxable income straight to shareholders. And in exchange, it pays almost no corporate tax itself. Its founder and CEO, Edward Aldag, had spent more than a decade building it into the largest hospital landlord in the United States. Steward's CEO, Ralph de la Torre, needed cash. Aldag had it. When the 2 men first started dealing in 2015, MPT held about $4 billion in total assets. Within a few years, Steward alone would account for more than 1/3 of everything MPT owned. Here's how the deal actually worked. MPT paid Steward a massive, above-market price for the buildings. Steward pocketed the windfall. And Steward, now a tenant inside hospitals it used to own outright, signed a 15-year lease with 3 5-year renewal options to rent those same buildings back. The ingredients were in place: an inflated sale, a captive tenant, and a landlord that had just discovered exactly how much a hospital chain would pay to keep the lights on. The only question left was the price of rent. Here's the method, and it starts with a number almost no one outside a few trade publications ever saw. In 2016, combined annual rent on the 9 hospitals came to about $104 million. Investigators later compared that to what Steward had originally paid to acquire those buildings, years before MPT ever showed up, and found the rent equaled roughly 75% of that purchase price. Not 75% once, 75% every year, indefinitely, with automatic increases built in. By 2019, the number had grown to $350 million a year, 42% of MPT's entire company revenue, extracted from less than 9% of the hospitals it owned. Inside MPT, the goal was stated plainly. A former financial analyst there, Alex Hubart, later described the company's own internal target as growth at all costs. A former MPT risk analyst, Cassie Marshall, put it more bluntly: everyone at the company knew Steward's financial situation. It was, in her words, a running joke. When Steward's finances got shakier, MPT didn't step back. It structured hundreds of millions more in loans, so the rent checks kept clearing. while internal talking points literally listed Steward valuation math under a heading, Things We Will Not Communicate. Meanwhile, MPT's own long-term debt nearly quadrupled, from $2.9 billion in 2016 to a peak of $11.3 billion 5 years later. In that same stretch, MPT paid its own shareholders $3.2 billion in dividends. Every figure in that sentence traces to MPT's own audited SEC filings. That's the method. Buy the ground under a hospital for far more than it's worth, rent it back at a price the hospital can barely survive, and keep the checks moving in exactly one direction. By May 2024, the math finally broke. Steward filed for bankruptcy, owing more than $9 billion, $6.6 billion of it in future rent to MPT alone, nearly $1 billion in unpaid bills to vendors and suppliers, $290 million in unpaid wages to its own staff. On August 31, 2024, 2 of the 9 hospitals from that original deal, Kearney Hospital and Neshoba Valley Medical Center, closed permanently. No buyer wanted them. 1,243 people lost their jobs in a single morning. Then, on September 11, 2024, a bankruptcy judge approved a settlement. Medical Properties Trust, the landlord that had collected rent equal to 75% of these hospitals' purchase price every year since 2016, agreed to walk away from $7.5 billion in claims against Steward, including that $6.6 billion in unpaid rent. In exchange, Steward dropped its own lawsuit accusing MPT of blocking hospital sales. Bankruptcy Judge Christopher Lopez called the deal, in his own words, nothing short of remarkable. No subpoena, no hearing, no contempt vote, just a signature, and both sides walked away. Before we go further, Medical Properties Trust deserves the strongest version of its own defense. Because it has one, and it's stronger than most companies in this position ever manage. MPT's spokesperson says the company stepped in with bridge loans and rent deferrals when no other party was willing to, because it believed these hospitals were critical to their communities. And in October 2024, MPT's own board hired the law firm Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen, and Katz to investigate. That investigation found no evidence MPT overpaid for the real estate and no evidence of wrongdoing at all. CEO Edward Aldag made the sharpest version of the argument on an earnings call. Rent, he said, was never on Steward's own list of what caused its financial stress. And if Steward wasn't paying MPT rent, it would have been paying interest and principal to some other lender instead. Hospitals need capital. Somebody was always going to charge for it. That argument has real weight, until you look at what a mortgage actually does that this rent never did. A mortgage shrinks. Every payment retires a little more principal until eventually the debt is gone and the borrower owns the building outright. MPT's rent never retired anything. It was fixed at roughly 75% of the purchase price, recurring every year forever with built-in increases, a bill that never gets smaller and never ends. And an investigation MPT's own board commissioned, using MPT's own hired law firm, isn't quite the same thing as an independent finding. Convenient, when the client gets to pick both the questions and the investigator. A third defense, and it's a fair one. MPT told CoStar that Steward was wrongfully blaming its landlord. Steward was blocking 2024 hospital sales to extract value from MPT. That fight is over the 2024 sale process, not whether the 2016 rent was sustainable. Same as the rest, both sides dropped their claims. At the start of this video, I told you about a landlord whose tenant let a device get repossessed. Now you have the context. Here's the rest of it. Steward owed device manufacturer Penumbra roughly $2.5 million, a real source number from Penumbra's own federal lawsuit. Weeks before that lawsuit was filed, Penumbra had already taken back the embolization coils it was owed for, from St. Elizabeth's Medical Center, one of the 9 hospitals in that 2016 MPT deal. In October 2023, Sungida Rashid gave birth at St. Elizabeth's. Her husband, Nabil Hake, later told CBS News it was a beautiful moment. He wasn't expecting it to be this blissful. Then Rashid began bleeding internally. Her doctors wanted the coil that could stop it. It wasn't there. She was transferred to another hospital. She didn't survive. To be exact about what caused what, Steward's decision not to pay its vendor is the documented direct cause of that repossession. Medical Properties Trust didn't repossess anything, and it didn't run the hospital floor that night. But MPT built and profited from the system that left Steward unable to pay its bills in the first place. Rent equal to 3/4 of these hospitals' value, every single year, pulled from the same account the vendor bills were supposed to come from. Rashid's hospital wasn't the only one from that original 9. Neshoba Valley Medical Center, mortgaged to MPT in that same 2016 deal, employed a nurse named Laura Baldwin for 7 years. In the summer of 2024, while recovering from 13 hours of her own cancer surgery, Baldwin learned her hospital was closing in 30 days. Neshoba Valley shut down the same morning as Kearney, August 31, 2024. 1,243 jobs gone by breakfast. Now here's the turn. Steward wasn't a one-time mistake. In 2019, MPT paid a second hospital chain, Prospect Medical Holdings, $1.5 billion for real estate Prospect's own internal valuation had put at $533 million. First-year rent, $116 million, climbing 7.5% a year. 4 hospitals in Pennsylvania alone were bought for 3 times what Prospect had paid 3 years earlier. Prospect Medical Holdings filed for bankruptcy in January 2025. Same landlord. Same math. 1 hospital chain running into a bad landlord is a scandal. 2 hospital chains collapsing under the identical structure, 3 years apart, is a business model. If a pattern like that is new to you, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe, and you'll never miss the version nobody else is telling. Every version of this recipe leaves the same 3 signs. Here's how to spot the next one before the funeral. Sign 1. Find out who actually owns the real estate underneath the operation you're trusting, the ingredient nobody puts on the label. Steward looked like a hospital company. The ground underneath it was owned, controlled, and priced by someone else entirely. Sign 2. Check whether the rent behaves like a mortgage or a leash. A mortgage shrinks towards 0. This method, rent at 3/4 of an inflated price recurring forever with built-in increases, never shrinks at all. If the payment never gets smaller, it was never designed to be paid off. Sign 3. Watch what happens when it collapses, and who gets asked to answer for it. Ralph de la Torre faced a subpoena, an empty chair, and a criminal contempt vote. Medical Properties Trust faced a bankruptcy judge who called their settlement nothing short of remarkable, and walked away from $7.5 billion with no hearing at all. You're not looking for the villain who shows up at the Senate hearing. You're looking for the name on the lease nobody read. St. Elizabeth's and Good Samaritan are Boston Medical Center's problem now. Its operating deficit more than doubled to $240 million after taking them on. Diana Richardson, who now runs the former Holy Family campuses, put it simply: the buildings were completely underinvested in every possible component you can imagine. The landlord is long gone. The bill is still being paid. If this is the version of the story you hadn't heard, subscribe to Business Recipe. Next time, a company that found an even faster way to hollow out a 100-year-old name without ever setting foot in bankruptcy court. Today's recipe complete. So, what business should we crack open next? Drop the company name in the comments. We read them. If you want more case studies like this one, subscribe. New recipe every Tuesday.